Just take a very simple example. Mark chapter 5 is an interesting story of Jesus healing the daughter of a man named Jairus. Jairus comes up to Jesus and he says to Jesus, "My daughter is ill. Please come and lay your hands on her so you can heal her." And Jesus starts to go to see the girl, but he's interrupted on the way. And before he can get to the house, some servants come from the house and they tell Jairus, "Don't worry, because she's dead already and there's no reason to bother the master anymore." Jesus says, "That's not a problem," and he goes to the house. She's dead now, but he raises her from the dead. Beautiful story in Mark chapter 5. Matthew also tells the story in Matthew chapter 9. But in Matthew chapter 9, when Jairus comes to Jesus, he says to him, "My daughter has just died. Can you do something?" Now, wait a second. Now, in Mark's gospel, the girl hadn't died yet. She was sick, but she died when Jesus was delayed. But in Matthew, she's dead already. Well, which is it? Now, many of you are saying, who cares? Well, it's a little detail. But why is it different? It couldn't be both. It couldn't be both. It has to be one or the other or neither. When I'm teaching my New Testament class to my students, I tell them that doing New Testament studies is kind of like doing detective work. A detective's been called on the scene of a crime, and there's a man who's dead in a pool of blood, and the detective starts looking around for little fingerprints and for a strand of hair. And a sensible person would say, "What in the world are you doing? There's a dead body here. Why are you looking for a strand of hair?" It's because a strand of hair can solve the crime. Sometimes the smallest things are what you need. Sometimes small details in the Gospels that are discrepancies show you something about the Gospels. Matthew and Mark cannot both be right about the occasion of Jairus' daughter. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples like that, many of them small, picayune, some of them rather significant. Give you some other examples. Let's think for a second about the birth of Jesus, having come through the recent Christmas holidays. The birth of Jesus is recounted in two of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. They're both very interesting accounts. One of the most interesting things is that they are completely at odds with one another. Sometime simply read through Matthew chapters 1 and 2 and list everything that happens, and then read through Luke chapters 1 and 2 and list everything that happens and compare your lists. You don't have to take it from me or from anyone else, just do it yourself. They tell many different stories, and sometimes they tell the same story differently. In both accounts, Jesus has a genealogy. The genealogy in Luke happens to come in chapter 3 after Jesus' birth, which is a strange place for a genealogy, but that's where it is. Luke chapter 3. Read the genealogy in Luke and read the genealogy in Matthew and ask yourself, who is allegedly Jesus' father in both? Well, it's Joseph, okay? Both genealogy trace Joseph's bloodline. And so, who is Joseph's father? It's different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his great-grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. The genealogies are different between Joseph all the way back to King David. And both genealogies claim to be giving the genealogy of Joseph. Why is that? Well, they probably had different sources, and they probably didn't know. They had sources that gave them genealogy. Genealogies are odds, but they can't be historically accurate because they're different. You have one father. You don't have two fathers. Well, maybe he was adopted by somebody, and so he had a stepfather. Yeah, maybe. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and Herod is out to kill the child. And so Joseph flees with his family to Egypt. Well, it's an interesting story when you put it up against what happens in Luke, because in Luke's gospel, Jesus and his family Joseph and Mary come from Bethlehem to Nazareth, and they stay there until Jesus is born, and then they perform the rites of purification, and then after that, they return to Nazareth. The rites of purification took place 32 days after the birth, according to Leviticus chapter 12. And so in Luke's gospel, they return home a month after giving birth. But in Matthew's gospel, they go to Egypt. How can it be both? Well, today it could be both because you could jump on a jet plane and there'd be no problem. But if you've got to walk to Egypt, it's a long way. What are they doing in Bethlehem in the first place? It depends which gospel you read. In Luke's gospel, the reason they're in Bethlehem is because there's a tax where the entire world has to be taxed under Caesar Augustus. And so Joseph has to register for the tax in Bethlehem because even though he lives in Nazareth, his ancestor David came from Bethlehem. And so he goes to register for the tax in Bethlehem with his betrothed. She gives birth there. After she gives birth there, 32 days later, they go back. I can tell you there was no tax under Caesar Augustus that the whole world had to be taxed and everybody returned to their ancestral home. Joseph goes to Bethlehem because David was his ancestor. David lived 1,000 years earlier than Joseph. You mean everybody in the Roman Empire, the whole world, is returning to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier to register for a tax? Imagine that the Canadian government, in all of its wisdom, decided to impose a new tax on you, and for this tax, you have to return to your ancestral home from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go? And no other source mentions this? It didn't even make the newspaper? Why does Luke have this census? Because he has to get Jesus born in Bethlehem, even though he knows that he came from Nazareth. It's a great story, but it didn't happen. There are even bigger events that didn't happen as narrated in the Gospels. And again, you can do this for yourself. Just read the texts horizontally, and you'll see what I mean. The death of Jesus. Both Mark, our earliest gospel, and John, our latest gospel, agree that Jesus died sometime during the Passover feast in Jerusalem, the annual celebration of the Passover. The Jews, of course, continue to celebrate today. Mark is quite explicit. Our first gospel is explicit. Jesus has a Passover meal with his disciples. Afterwards, he goes out and he's arrested. When Judas betrays him, he spends the night in jail, and he's put on the cross the next morning at 9 o'clock a.m., the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. John, our latest gospel, is also quite explicit. There's no word about Jesus and the disciples having a Passover meal. Jesus goes out and he's arrested. He spends the night in jail. He's put on trial, and Pontius Pilate condemns him to death afternoon, not at 9 o'clock, afternoon on the day before the Passover meal was to be eaten. John 19, verse 14 says it explicitly. Well, did he eat the Passover meal or not? In Mark, yes. In John, no. They can't both be right. He didn't get crucified at 2 different times. He got crucified once. Well, which day was it? They both can't be right. There are discrepancies. There are discrepancies in the resurrection narratives of the New Testament. I have my disciples, my disciples at Chapel Hill, do this assignment every year. Just read what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say about the resurrection and make a list of what each one says and compare your list. Who goes to the tomb? Is it one woman or several women? What are their names? It depends which gospel you read. Was the stone already rolled away before they got there? It depends which gospel you read. What did they see there? Did they see a man there? Did they see 2 men there, or did they see an angel there? It depends which gospel you read. What were they told to do? Depends which gospel you read. Did they do it? Depends which gospel you read. Were the disciples supposed to go to Galilee to see Jesus, and they did so? Or were they ordered not to leave Jerusalem, and they did so? These are discrepancies. They're not simply differences. Why? Because they are different stories. But if they're different, they can't be accurate. Excuse me, I I inherited a cough last week, and I see it's deciding now to reappear at this timely moment. Or else Craig has been praying. Why do you get these discrepancies? Could I have 30 more minutes added to my time, please? Scholars today are convinced that the reason we have discrepancies such as these is because these books were not written by eyewitnesses who accurately recorded the things that happened. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing decades after the life of Jesus. Decades later. Probably the first gospel was Mark, maybe around the year 70. I'll be surprised if Craig and I are very different on this, but we may be. But almost everybody puts the Gospel of Mark around the year 70 or so. Matthew and Luke maybe around the year 80 to 85. John maybe around the year 90 or 95. In other words, these Gospels are separated from the life of Jesus by 35 to 65 years. 35 to 65 years. These gospel writers were not the disciples of Jesus. These gospel writers are writing in highly literate Greek. These are highly educated Greek-speaking Christians living decades later. They've heard stories about Jesus that they write down. The stories have been in circulation year after year after year after year by word of mouth. And most of the people telling the stories about Jesus year after year after year were not his disciples, but people who had converted to come to believe in Jesus, who were trying to convert somebody else, who then tries to convert somebody else, who then converts somebody else. Everybody telling stories about Jesus. Of course the stories got changed. When the gospel writers wrote them down, they had their own agendas, and so they changed the stories on occasion in those contexts as well. The stories got changed. That's okay if what you're interested in is the religious significance of the story. But if you're interested in historical accuracy, you don't want stories to change. You want to know what really happened. Sometimes the differences are not discrepancies in detail. Sometimes they're differences in emphases that really matter. I'll give you one example. Mark has a very powerful portrayal of Jesus going to his death. Jesus has been betrayed by one of his followers. He's turned over to Pontius Pilate, and during his trial, Jesus doesn't say anything to Pontius Pilate except Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Su leges," you say so. That's all he says. He's taken out to be crucified. He doesn't say anything. He goes to the place of crucifixion. He's silent the entire way. They nail him to the cross, and he's silent. You get the idea of Jesus being in shock at what's happening to him. While he's on the cross, everybody mocks him. The Roman soldiers mock him. The people passing by mock him. Both other people being crucified mock him in Mark's gospel. At the end, Jesus, who has been betrayed and denied and deserted and handed over and condemned and mocked, Jesus on the cross finally cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" And he dies. Jesus goes to a painful, humiliating death, unsure of why it's happening to him in Mark's gospel. Contrast that with Luke's gospel. In Luke, you have some of the same elements, but a very, very different emphasis. In Luke's gospel, when Jesus is going to be crucified, he's not silent. He sees some women by the side of the road, and he turns his head to them, and he's carrying his cross, and he says to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children, for the fate that's to befall you." Here, Jesus isn't in shock, not wondering why this is happening. He's concerned about these people more than himself. While being nailed to the cross in Luke's gospel, Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." That's not in Mark, that's in Luke. While Jesus is hanging on the cross, it's not that both robbers mock him. One of the crucified people mocks him, and the other turns his head to the man and says to be quiet because Jesus hasn't done anything to deserve this. He then looks to Jesus and he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replies to him in Luke, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. This is not somebody who's wondering why this is happening to him. He knows what's happening to him, he knows why it's happening to him, and he knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. He's going to wake up in paradise, and this guy's going to be with him. At the end, most telling of all, in Luke's gospel, instead of crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," and dies. Jesus does not feel forsaken in Luke's gospel. This is a very different portrayal from the one you get in Mark. And the mistake people make is pretending that what Mark has to say is the same thing that Luke has to say, and that what Luke has to say is the same thing that Mark has to say. These are two different gospels with two different points of view. And if you smash them together into one kind of mega gospel, you have ruined the emphasis of each one. And then you throw in Matthew. And he says everything he said, not just in Mark, but in Luke, but also Matthew. Then you throw it in John, and you have the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, which are found in none of the Gospels. Now, you're free to do that if you want, to take all 4 Gospels and smash them together into one big gospel. It's a free world. You can do that if you want. But realize what you're doing. You are writing your own gospel instead of accepting the Gospels that have come to you. Mark has a message that he wants to convey about Jesus, and it is different from Luke's message, and that's different from Matthew's message, and that's different from John's message. If you're interested in the religious value of these books, you have to let each author give you his message and not pretend it's somebody else's message. But what if you're interested not in the religious value of the book, but in the historical accuracy? If you're interested in historical accuracy, 4 discrepant accounts cannot be historically accurate. It can't work. It can't work with Gospels any more than it can work in a criminal courtroom where you have eyewitnesses who say different things. You don't assume they're all right. You try to figure out which one is right. And that's what you do with the Gospels. Sometimes these differences are very big indeed between the Gospels. It is only in the Gospel of John that Jesus declares himself to be divine. Only the Gospel of John portrays Jesus as one who is himself God. You don't get that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Only in John does Jesus say, "I and the Father are one." Only in John does Jesus say, "Before Abraham was, I am." Only John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." John is quite clear that Jesus is divine. Is that the historical Jesus, or is that a theological Jesus? I think it's perfectly fine if you want to accept that theological point of view of Jesus. But it's a different question from saying that that's historically something Jesus really said about himself. If you're interested in history, you want to know what really happened. Suppose over the next 30 years we ask 4 people to write up biographies of President Jimmy Carter. These 4 people have never heard of Jimmy Carter, like most of my students, for whom Jimmy Carter is ancient history. And these 4 people are not allowed to consult any written documents. They only can use oral reports that they've heard about Jimmy Carter. They can also use one another's works, though. These biographies are then produced by these 4 people who base everything on oral traditions that they've heard. They're collected and they're examined. It turns out they're all quite moving and powerful portrayals of Jimmy Carter, but in a great number of places they contradict each other. often in little ways, but sometimes in large ways, with very different portrayals of who Jimmy Carter really was. In a number of places, they contradict what historians know about the facts of history. And in other places, they make claims for Carter that are clearly historically impossible to have happened. Would you say these sources could be trusted to give you a historically accurate account? Or would you say that if you want to use these sources historically, you have to figure out where there are errors, mistakes, alterations of historical fact, contradictions, exaggerations, and biased reporting? If the latter, then you're saying that you cannot trust them as historical sources. They may contain historical information, but they're not reliable as presentations of who Jimmy Carter was. The Bible also cannot be trusted as a historical source. It may provide great literature, and you may choose to use it for your theological beliefs. You may be able to, moreover, you may be able to determine what actually happened to Jesus based on its biased reporting, but the gospel accounts themselves present non-historical views of Jesus and are not historically accurate. Thank you very much.